This is how you cross over from Israel to Gaza. And right now we're in no man's land.
Prime Minister, do you now regret when once asked what your favourite joke was, you replied Nick Clegg? And Deputy Prime Minister, what do you think of that?
Mr. Trump, why should you be president? What makes you fit for the role? Is it just one big ego trip?
Thank you very much.
People aren't sure they can trust what you say. You say things and then it turns out that they're not quite what you said. My name's Andy Bell and I've been a journalist for over 30 years with the BBC, Sky and ITN. In this podcast series, How Did We Get Here?, I provide context and background to a big story in the news by talking to someone with real knowledge and insight. For this edition, as record numbers of migrants and asylum seekers cross the channel in small boats, taking terrible risks, how many people are coming to Britain and where are they coming from? What has the end of free movement from EU countries meant for the numbers coming here? And is this a country where immigration is going up or going down? I've been talking to Madeleine Sumption, the director of the Migration Observatory, part of Oxford University and the country's foremost independent body analysing the numbers coming to the UK. Madeleine Sumption, thanks very much for talking to us for this edition of How Did We Get Here? Immigration, such a massive issue all the time for most people, for the country, for politicians. Let's jump in straight with the big question, which maybe a lot of people have. Right now into the UK, is immigration going up or is it going down?
So you'd think that there should be a really straightforward answer to that question, especially from someone like me. I'm basically a data nerd. And unfortunately, because of COVID, there has been quite a lot of chaos in immigration data. And so we actually, a couple of years ago, I would have been able to give you a very clear answer to that question. Now there is some uncertainty. What I will say is that it was going up pre-pandemic. We then, of course, from March 2020, had total chaos, everywhere, including in the immigration system. And there was much lower immigration to the UK. We had basically, particularly among EU citizens, the data we do have suggests that there was a net outflow of people. So the population of EU migrants in the UK actually shrunk, which was quite unusual. And then we've seen some recovery during the course of sort of late 2020, 2021. So what it looks like based on the sort of limited data that we have now is that non-EU migration has recovered. EU migration still seems to be quite low. And part of that is that, while the economy has been recovering from COVID, we of course have the post-Brexit immigration system. That was introduced at the beginning of 2021, and that is much more restrictive than what we had beforehand. So based on what we know so far, it looks like that has had an impact on the EU side of reducing the numbers of people coming here.
Okay, well, look, we'll get into more of the detail of this in a moment. Just a quick kind of guide maybe for people. When I suspect we'll talk about net immigration a little bit. Just define net for me from your point of view.
Yes, so we have basically immigration and emigration. Immigration, people coming in to live and work. And when we would talk about people coming in, exclude all of the tourists and the very short-term visitors. We're talking about people actually coming to live here. And then emigration is people leaving. And net migration is basically immigration minus emigration. So it's sort of roughly equivalent to how much the migrant population is going up.
Just to cast our minds back maybe to the EU referendum and the target that David Cameron had set at that point of 100,000 net immigration. I seem to remember that during the campaign, the figure popped out of around 350,000, triple that. Can we say where we are on that figure right now? I understand when you're saying that it's been a bit confusing with COVID. Can we get anywhere near a ballpark figure for that net figure?
We have a ballpark figure for 2020, and the answer there seems to be that the net migration target was in fact achieved in 2020. Obviously...
So less than 100,000?
It was less than 100,000 in 2020, as far as we know. And the Office of National Statistics thinks that net migration in 2020 was perhaps as low as 34,000. Now that's obviously nothing to do with government policy on migration, nothing to do with Brexit. This is the pandemic. This is people being physically unable to come here or returning home in order to be with their family members. Since then, We don't have yet a net migration figure for 2021, but I would be astonished if it was less than 100,000. I mean, I think that is just, it was always a target that was rather ambitious, and no one who worked in the weeds of immigration data like I do, no one thought that it was likely to be achieved short of some sort of extraordinary catastrophe, which is what we said at the time. And then, of course, we had an extraordinary catastrophe. That was what happened in 2020, and that was, the sort of thing that brings net migration to very low levels like 30,000.
Okay, so essentially that was an extraordinary event. I can only imagine how pleased David Cameron would have been able to say if he could have said, look, we've hit this target. With, as you say, it seems to be a product of an extraordinary event. The next obvious question then is where is everyone coming from? You've already hinted at this. Less from the EU, more from the rest of the world.
Yes, yeah, that's right. So traditionally, most immigration to the UK has actually been from non-EU countries. India has been, over the several decades, has been a major country of origin for migrants. And that's a kind of across the spectrum. So you have basically international students, people coming as workers, people coming to join family members. There's also another really important country of origin at the moment is China, and that's particularly the case for international students. A lot of international students are from China. But then you have, other common countries, Nigeria and the Philippines. Also, you have a lot of people coming in on work visas, particularly to work in the NHS from those two countries. But there's also a lot of diversity. I mean, the United States actually often, in many categories of immigration, shows up as a big country of origin. So that's, on the non-EU side, effectively, there are some major countries, but there's quite a range of people from across the world. And then on the EU side, it used to be that there was quite a lot of migration from Eastern European countries that joined the EU in 2004 or 2007. So, the biggest ones being Poland and Romania. And then also, after the Euro crisis, we saw a lot of immigration from Southern European countries like Spain and Portugal. As far as we can tell from the data on who's getting visas under the post-Brexit immigration system, the numbers from Eastern European countries seem to be pretty low now. And so most of the visas that are going to EU citizens are going to people from countries like Germany, who've been the longest-standing EU members.
But many fewer from the EU now.
Yes, as far as we can tell, with the caveat that all of the data was sort of broken. But the expectation, based on the visa information that we do have, is that when we start getting sort of proper immigration statistics over the next year or so, because they will come back, is that the share coming from the EU will be much lower.
But is the absolute number? We've talked about how there was a blip in 2020. If the absolute number continues to go up, have we basically just changed where people are coming from rather than reducing the absolute numbers?
I think that the absolute number of let's say total net migration to the UK will be lower as a result of Brexit than we would have seen anyway. So Brexit, there were some minor liberalisations for non-EU citizens, so it's slightly easier to get a work visa now than it was pre-Brexit. But it is much harder for EU citizens to get a work visa, and there were periods over the last 10 years where EU citizens made up a majority of people coming to the UK. So I think, compared to what we would have had if free movement had continued, I think that there's a reasonable consensus the numbers will be lower. That doesn't necessarily mean, policy is only one of the things that affects migration. And actually this is quite important to remember, because I think the political debate sort of behaves as if this is something, government sort of sets the number of people coming in, and they, the policy is, neatly categorized into different boxes, and they have total control over the numbers. And actually what the government controls is the criteria, but they don't control how many people meet those criteria. They don't control how many people decide to get married, and therefore, come in on family visas. They don't control whether, how the labour market does, and sort of, ups and downs in the labour market affect that. So often we see, fluctuations in migration are probably more often nothing to do with policy, but the sort of underlying, what's going on in the world and in the UK. Just
to jump back for a second, if you are somebody, though, who really wanted to see immigration reduced, can you say, good, that worked?
Well, so with the caveat that we don't yet have the data, and when we have the data obviously will be able to say sort of, has it gone up or down? I think for people who want to see immigration to the UK reduced, I think that what we have now is a more restrictive system that will admit fewer people. I don't think it's going to be a total game changer. I think the UK is still going to be a country that receives moderate levels of immigration. And shifting a country, I think it's easy to make tweaks around the margins and say, okay, we'll have a few of these categories will be a bit more restrictive, fewer people will come in. But you're never going to reduce immigration sort of long term by, 80%, or you're not going to shift the UK from being a country of moderate levels of immigration to a low immigration country without something much more dramatic than the kinds of changes that we've seen.
Okay, looking away from Europe for a second, people will have seen what happened in Afghanistan over the summer. There is a specific scheme now to bring people from Afghanistan. Will that make much of a difference? What are the numbers we're talking about there?
And in terms of the total numbers of people coming to the UK, asylum and refugee flows combined tend to make up a pretty small share. So, and just to distinguish, so asylum seekers would be people who show up under their own steam and then apply for protection, and they may be granted that status, whereas resettled refugees are people who are brought directly from abroad and have that status before they arrive. The number of resettled refugees, there's actually some uncertainty about exactly what the government has both committed to and will be able to do. But the numbers are sort of, we're talking in the range of, 5, maybe 10,000 people a year maximum. And if you compare that, in a standard year pre-pandemic, the UK would be granting 600,000 or 700,000 visas, both short-term and long-term, for people coming for sort of work, study and family reasons. So it is not, obviously it attracts a lot of attention, often for good reasons, but quantitatively it is not what's driving migration to the UK.
Can I ask you about another specific place where immigrants are coming in on a specific scheme, which is Hong Kong? It feels like it's been slightly under the radar, but can you give me an idea of the numbers that are coming from Hong Kong and how they're coming?
Yes, yeah. So this scheme is really interesting, actually, because it's totally unprecedented in recent migration history. The government effectively said that anyone who has the British national overseas status, which a majority of the population in Hong Kong do, would or is a family member of one of those people, can come to the UK. They can apply for a visa, pay some reasonably hefty fees, but there aren't significant other criteria. And it was totally unknown how many people who were going to take up the scheme. And actually the Home Office did, they had to do an impact assessment, as they always do, and the range of people, the range of what the sort of lower bound to the upper bound of how many people might come in was astonishing. They were saying, maybe a few thousand, maybe 1 million for a period of several years. What has turned out is that actually the numbers have been pretty much in the sort of middle of what that's kind of what they called their central estimate. So we've had when the scheme opened at the end of January to the end of September, which is what we've got the data for at the moment, there were just under 90,000 applications. We don't know how much, and that may go up in the coming years, depending on how things develop in Hong Kong, or it may go down if it's the case that people who were desperate to get out sort of mostly, they were the ones who took it up right away. So migration in general, but particularly these types of flows that are driven partly by crises, are notoriously difficult to predict.
All right, and then one other group that's been getting a lot of attention, small boat arrivals. People obviously see that in the news and hear that this is another record figure, another record year for people arriving. Again, can you give us a number for, say, the last year, and how does that fit in context? Yeah,
so the Home Office doesn't regularly publish official numbers on small boat arrivals. I suspect it will probably have to start doing that because it's become such a big issue politically. So we don't have official data. Their calculations by news agencies suggest that, and those have tended to be reasonably reliable, those calculations suggest around 28,000 people
last year, so that was in 2021 by small boat. So that and that's a lot higher than the year before. It was more like 8,500, and a few years ago it was it was very small numbers. So that's obviously very significant. Again, quantitatively, it's not what's driving migration to the UK when you compare that to the sort of 600,000 or 700,000 visas a year that would be issued. But certainly, obviously, it's still important in the sense that people are taking some pretty serious risks in order to come through that route. The Borders and Nationality Bill, which the government is taking through Parliament at the moment, I'm just interested in, does that have an impact on immigrants, asylum seekers, refugees? I know we have a tendency to mix all this up. Where could that potentially have a real impact? I'm thinking particularly, probably with asylum seekers, people trying to get across the channel. But does it have a broader impact as well, just on anyone who wants to come to the UK?
It will have potentially quite a big impact on asylum seekers. The flagship provision in the Borders and Nationality Bill is effectively to discriminate against asylum seekers that the government thinks should have applied in other countries, and to give, even if they are successful in their claim, so even if the government recognises that they would face persecution if they returned back home, those who can't be removed to other countries, and probably not that many will be for reasons I can explain, would be granted a status where previously they would have been given refugee status. Under the bill, they would be given a lesser status that the details of the sort of implementation of which we don't yet know, but basically it would include potentially things like not having access to welfare benefits, not being able to bring in family members, and having a much longer period on temporary status before they're able to settle permanently in the UK.
That sounds like a bit of a sort of limbo status. So they probably wouldn't be removed, but they'll be kind of even in an even worse situation than people who are normally waiting for their asylum claim to be processed. Is that right?
Yes. So, the government's position is that they should be removed, and that their claims should be heard in another country. It's actually very difficult to remove people, even if they have spent substantial time in another country, just because the other countries need to agree to take them back. There were some mechanisms, as when we were part of the EU, there was a policy that, at least in principle, allowed asylum seekers to be transferred between countries. That's no longer the case. So the numbers of people actually being removed sort of under the post-Brexit immigration system are trivially low. And I think, obviously maybe there will be new returns agreements, but in the absence of a dramatic change on that front, the main impact of the bill is not really going to be for people to be removed, but for those who remain in the UK and get status will have sort of a less desirable status.
You talked about how hard it is to remove people. Is that basically just because to remove somebody, you've got to have the agreement of the country that you're removing them to, and essentially nobody wants to do that? Is that the essential problem?
Yeah, that's the main issue. There are other issues around that. Sometimes people don't have good identity documentation, and often it's not clear where they came from. But I think one of the biggest issues is just agree. This is a controversial issue in many countries, and there isn't widespread international agreement, and it's been really difficult for countries to agree what is appropriate way of sharing the responsibilities to accommodate asylum seekers and refugees.
Do you think it can work? I think it's technically the Nationality and Borders Bill. I think I call it the Borders and Nationality Bill. Do you think it can actually work and make a difference if you just you try and criminalise people who arrive as asylum seekers and then you can't even send them back to another country? On the face of it, it looks like that could be a bit difficult to make work.
Well, yeah, it depends what your objective is, really. I think one thing the government has said is that they hope to deter people from coming because people, will see what's on offer and, will decide not to try to come to the UK. I think there is a fair amount of evidence that is not necessarily going to work in the way intended. And the reason for that basically is that people have some idea of what's going to greet them on the other side, but often not a very good idea. And the information that people have about what policies are is often quite limited, or it's inaccurate. It sort of filters through, different social networks. And so your policy on what happens to people after they arrive is not necessarily a powerful tool. And there was actually an interesting study a number of years ago that looked at whether these policies that reduce asylum seekers' well-being after they arrive affect the numbers of asylum seekers in a particular country, and found that it didn't. It found that there was an impact if you physically prevent people from arriving. Some of those measures, more sort of enforcement measures, may have some impact, but penalising them afterwards was not associated with a lower number of applications.
On the big picture of how people coming to the UK, you've talked about us being a country of moderate immigration. How do we compare, say, per head of population in terms of numbers as much as we can gauge it? How do we compare with European neighbours? How do we compare with the United States, for instance, in terms of numbers coming per head of population?
So if you look across OECD high-income countries, we're roughly in the middle of the pack. So the level, we've got around 14% or so of the population was born in another country, and that includes people who are now British citizens and those who are still foreign citizens. That's basically similar to France, Spain, United States. It's lower than, there are a number of EU countries that have higher levels. Ireland and Sweden, for example, is much lower actually than somewhere like Australia or Canada. Australia has more than double the migrant share of the population. So I would say the UK is actually pretty standard among comparable high income countries.
And you've also raised the idea that governments like to think they can pull levers and that will basically fix problems. We'll put in a new bit of legislation and that will stop this. In the end, it's about the state of the economy. Am I right in thinking? Is that what drives or attracts immigrants? That if you have a booming economy in this country, for instance, suddenly you want a whole lot of people and there's a reason for them to come, and companies here want to bring people in. Is that the biggest driver, or is that too simplistic of you?
No, that's one of the big drivers. The state of the economy is important, particularly obviously for people who are coming for work. A lot of people aren't coming for work. Another major draw is universities, the UK's universities for international students.
That's true. Sorry to jump in. We should remind people that students are counted in the immigration numbers, aren't they? Even if in theory they're coming for to study for 2 years. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. They would obviously, when you look at the net migration numbers, to the extent that they go home afterwards, they're not going to be in there long term. But yes, no, students are counted, and some of them do stay on and work afterwards. You've also got family members. That's another quite important, particularly for long term settlement, because family members are more likely to stay long term and settle here. And that's driven, not so much by the state of the economy, but by the fact that the UK has a long history of immigration. There's sort of, networks around the world. It's a very global world now. People go abroad, they get married. So that is another factor that, is not an economic factor.
Do you see, this is kind of coming to our final thoughts now, do you see immigration growing in the next couple of years? It's
really difficult to predict migration levels, and to be honest, most attempts to do it have not been very successful. I think that the post-Brexit immigration system will probably have an impact on reducing immigration kind of compared to what it would otherwise have been, but that in the long run, levels of migration will probably be, reasonably stable. I don't see any reason that there would be a dramatic decrease. They could grow. I don't think that they would grow massively, but these things are always, effectively anyone's guess.
Would it remain a big issue for government to tackle, do you think? Is it just a fact of life? Immigration, whatever's going on, is always just a fact that governments have to worry about?
Sure. There will always be some immigration. Unless you're North Korea, there are always going to be people moving across borders. Even if you tried to limit migration, to have the strictest migration rules possible, you're still going to have people coming in as family members. And, if you wanted really dramatic attempts to reduce migration would end up, probably not being that popular, because it would mean things like not bringing in international students who are actually economically quite beneficial for the UK, not bringing in skilled workers who, similarly thought to bring reasonably significant economic benefits.
And we've already seen the government having to change some of the rules and say, right, we're going to have a scheme to bring in this category of workers, for instance. I mean, the fact is, you often do need to plug these gaps with the labour force that is not, homegrown.
Yes, I mean, you use the word need, which is interesting because it's one of the difficult things about immigration policy is there often isn't actually an objective answer to what we need. So you take the example of social care, for example, which is very salient at the moment. The social care industry, does it need migrant workers? Well, there are real difficulties that social care employers are having employing people at the moment, and migration could help mitigate some of those problems. However, there are some commentators who look at it and say, no, that this is not a migration problem. This is the fact that people in social care are just not paid enough. And if you properly fund your social care system, then you wouldn't need migration. And so I think a lot of the reason that it's difficult to sort of come up with technocratic answers and say, well, these are the number of people we need, is that actually it often ends up being a sort of a much more complicated question of, well, what are your other policy objectives? And you may have a choice between, 2 or 3 different potential solutions that are unpalatable to politicians for different reasons.
It's a very interesting point to end on, and it was obviously something that was discussed at the time of the EU referendum as well, whether that immigration from Eastern Europe was suppressing wages, and different people had very different views. But Madeleine Sumption, thank you very much indeed for talking to us for this edition of How Did We Get Here. I suspect we will continue to talk about immigration for some time yet, in fact, probably forever, but maybe it will rise and fall in terms of just how politically difficult an issue it is. But thank you very much indeed for talking to us and putting that in context.
You're welcome. Pleasure talking to you.
Madeleine Sumption from the Migration Observatory, with her reflection that governments can take measures on immigration, but in the end it took a worldwide pandemic to deliver David Cameron's net immigration target. If you have thoughts on this or ideas for other podcasts, you can email me on andy.bell@itn.co.uk, and I'm tweeting it at AndyBell5News. And please share, rate and review. Thank you for listening to this edition of How Did We Get Here? There'll be another along soon.